All right, I want to take a look here at the 2018 Microeconomics exam FRQ number 1. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so again, this is, I'm not a huge fan of this question. It is a long FRQ, but actually it's, as the FRQs go, this one is relatively short. The reason I'm not a fan of this one is, well, I'll talk about it a little bit, but some of these parts B and C specifically, there are a couple different answers you could use to get the points. So a couple of ways to explain it. So I'll do my best to explain what makes sense to me, but be sure to take a look at the rubric and try and understand all the different ways that you could have explained it, right? Because there's sort of more than one way to get to the points. All right, so let's go through, read here quick. In the early 20th century, limited transportation options and the lack of effective substitutes gave single cinema monopoly power in a small town. Assume that single cinema is a profit maximizing firm and currently operates at a negative economic profit in the short run. All right, so we have what's given as a monopoly, right? They tell you right straight here, you're going to be drawing the monopoly graph. The reason I don't like, well, the first reason I don't like this question is because they're asking you to draw a monopoly graph. We very rarely draw a monopoly graph with a negative economic profit, right? Generally, monopolies are making economic profits. So I think that could throw you off. But I guess then again, they're also testing to make sure you understand the concept and can draw correctly economic profit, right, and not just regurgitate the typical monopoly graph. So maybe I guess that's what they're getting at in this one. So let me see. Wanted to get, let's see. Go back. Sorry, I can never remember how to get back to my all right. There it is. Share the whiteboard. I can remember how to find that whiteboard. All right, so first question, part A. We wanted to draw a monopoly graph with negative economic profits, right? So remember, said that's not usually what we would draw with a monopoly graph, but that's okay. So let's go ahead. Oops, draw our graph nice and big. Again, you got to make sure you label all this stuff. You know, some of the variables they told you how they wanted you to label it, the price and quantity. So be sure to do that. All right, so monopoly graph, we start with our chopsticks, right, for lack of a better description. So we got our demand curve and we've got our marginal revenue curve down here. All right, so you got to think ahead a little bit here before you draw in the cost curves, because you know, or they've asked that we want to show ultimately a negative economic profit box, right? So think about where the average total cost curve needs to be in relation to these curves already on here before you draw it to show a negative economic profit. So we know when we calculate economic profit or show that box, we're going to compare the price, and the price always ends up on the demand curve. We know that. So somewhere on the demand curve, and then we're going to compare that price to the cost at that quantity, right, wherever the average total cost curve. So if you think ahead and you know, hey, I need to show somewhere where the average total cost is going to be greater than the price, right, such that I'm losing money, right, I'm making negative economic profits. That should be clear that you need to draw the average total cost somewhere up above the demand curve. All right, so let's label ATC. And hopefully it'll be clear as we fill in and try to shade the box here. Now you also need, don't forget, marginal cost curve. Remember, average total cost is just sort of a U-shaped curve. And as long as you're sort of in the right area. So, and then the marginal cost curve is a U-shaped curve, but you also need to make sure that it does cross the average total cost here at the minimum of that curve, right? That relationship still holds true, even though we're drawing the ATC way up above the demand curve here. All right, so what else you need? So firm profit maximizing, where MR equals MC, that's going to be, they're going to come down and find their quantity. They wanted this labeled Q sub M. And then also remember, in a monopoly, at that quantity, right, the market demand is way up here. So the firm can kind of go all the way up to the demand curve, and that's how they determine their price come across. Right, so P sub M. So there we have our profit maximizing quantity and price for this monopolist. Now you notice, right? Oh, okay, we need to shade the economic profit box. Well, actually, in this case, it's an economic loss. So this is the reason we had to think ahead where we're going to draw our ATC curve. So if my price is here, right, my revenue is price times quantity. So that's my revenue. But then I'm going to compare it to whatever my cost is at that quantity, right? So I go all the way up to my average total cost curve where that intersects, come across, and they wanted to shade the box. We need to shade this whole box here. All right, so because of the fact that my ATC is above wherever my price is, this firm is making losses. If the average total cost was somewhere down below, down here, then you could shade that box and that would be economic profits. And the reason I say is usually when we draw a monopoly graph, that's what we do, right? We illustrate profits, and that's why this question is sort of a little bit different, because they don't give you that. So as long as you understand what the economic profit box is showing, I don't think it's too difficult a question. You just have to think ahead as to where you want to put those curves before you put them on the graph. All right, so let's scroll back here. All right, so we did part A, or part 1, and we did part 2, right? We shaded the economic profit, shaded completely. Okay. Part B, explain why single cinema continues to operate in the short run despite earning negative economic profit in the short run. All right, so we drew a short run economic loss, which is kind of odd, right? Why would a firm continue to operate? I think the, let's just write this rule over right here. Firms will operate as long as price is going to be greater than your average variable cost. So really that's all you need to say here. And if they tell us, hey, this firm is making economic losses in the short run, we know, or we must know, even though the average total cost curve is up here, you know, the average total cost is made up of average variable cost plus average fixed cost, right? So we don't know, but perhaps at this quantity, maybe it's a small quantity and the fixed costs are playing a huge role here. And this price is still above the average variable costs that we have to assume if they're going to stay open. That's, you know, the explanation, right? So as long as the price is above the variable cost, a firm should continue to operate, even if they're making economic losses in the short run. But because the price is above the variable cost, in a way, they're making some of those fixed costs back, right? So if this firm could find a way to increase its quantity, right, then presumably at some point it would move into economic profits, right? And hopefully that would be what happens in the long run, right? So that's why a firm might stay open in the short run, even though it's making total economic losses. And again, there are a couple other ways you could explain this. So be sure to take a look at the rubric, and whichever one makes the most sense to you, that, you know, you should go with that, or be able to understand that. All right, let's go back. All right, so that's part B. Part C, would single cinema's total revenue increase, decrease, or stay the same if it decides to sell one fewer ticket than Q sub M. All right, so this is a price elasticity of demand sort of question. I actually want to, the question is asking, what'll happen to total revenue if we sell one fewer ticket over here, right? What it's asking essentially is the price effect greater than the quantity effect, or vice versa, right? So let me clear all this. All right, so if you think back to price elasticity of demand, right? The formula for this is delta percent change in price over delta percent change. I'm sorry, I messed that up. Another reason I don't like this question, price elasticity of demand. Delta change in quantity over delta change in price, right? How sensitive is quantity to change in quantity to sensitivity to change in price? So let's just draw just any old demand curve here. So there's a phrase, being on the elastic part of the demand curve and then being on the inelastic part of the demand curve. And then there's a part of the demand curve where you will be essentially units elastic, right? Where this ratio would be equal to 1. So think about it this way. There's let's just draw our sort of midpoint here, where this would essentially draw a square, right? That would be where they were equal. And close to that point, right, the delta change, if you went one way or the other, would be something close to the same in either case. And so this would be on this part of the curve, right, unit elastic. Now, let's draw up here. Okay, you notice the quantity is relatively small down here with respect to the price, right? So if you think about percent change, down here, a small move in quantity is going to be a pretty big percent change, right? Whereas up here, we're way up here. So think about this, almost the rectangle here, right? This percent change is going to be much larger than this percent change, right? As we move sort of along this curve. So, you know, we know the price elasticity demand over here is going to be greater than 1, right? So that hence the elastic part of the demand curve, right? So the quantity is more sensitive to change than the price up here. Now flip that, right? So let's go way over here. Sorry. In this case over here, right, the percent change in a quantity over here, we got a much larger quantity. So the percent change as we move right or left is not going to be as much as the price, right? The price has come way down. So a percent change here either way is going to be a much larger factor. So on this part of the demand curve, it's less than 1 and demand is inelastic. So that's what we mean by you know, being on the elastic part of the demand curve versus the inelastic. So think about it. So the elastic part of the demand curve is generally further to the left, right, on this graph, where you know, you're going to get bigger percent changes for the quantities you're talking about than as you move to the right part of the curve where the quantity is much larger. So let's go back. All right, so that said, and I erased my original graph, but if you take a look at that, it should be clear that you are further to the left on that part of the curve, where it would be part of the elastic part of the demand curve. So what that means, so we know we're on the elastic. Let's go back up here, right? So the PED, right, price elasticity demand is greater than 1. So we know it's elastic. So we know quantity will, the effect of quantity change will be greater than the price change. So in that case, what it means is that our revenue will decrease, right? Because the fact that we sold 1 less ticket is a bigger effect than the price change in that part of the curve. Again, this is, you can explain this a couple of different ways. That's the one that, it is a price elasticity of demand question, but there are a couple of ways you can explain it. So take a look at the rubric and go through some of the different ways you can get to the points in this one. All right, so part D, single cinema hires workers in a perfectly competitive labor market with a downward sloping demand curve. Suppose the number of workers available in the market decreases. Okay, so I guess I'll go back to here. All right, so we have one employer, perfectly competitive labor market, and they're going to ask us what happens to wage, right? So in this case, we have price, but we know that we're talking about wages here and quantity, right? So here's our wage one, right? And this is just a simple, if there are fewer workers, I forget how they worded it. How did they word it here? Just the number of workers available in the market decreases, right? So that's a supply shift, leftward supply shift. So supply one, I guess. And you see the wage increased, right? That makes sense. Supply went down, wage rate went up. All right, so question one should be wage rate increases. You can explain it, but I think in this case, it might be better just to draw a graph as well. A picture's worth 1,000 words. So as long as you're sort of drawing the right graph, and then maybe a sentence below to show that, hey, I see that wage rate increase from W1 to W2 or whatever you labeled it. Part two, what will happen to the marginal revenue product of the last worker hired? So remember in labor markets, right? The demand curve for labor is derived from the marginal revenue product. So we're moving along that curve, right? We're going back up that curve. Let's go back here. Right, we're moving sort of this way, right? So the marginal revenue product of the last worker hired is now going to be greater if we got rid of essentially we hired less workers, right? So in this case, actually in both cases, both of these increased, right? So, and again, I think it would be helpful to draw a picture there to be able to explain that. But also take a look, and this is why I'm not a huge fan of this question. There, I gave you sort of one way to work through B, C, and D, right? There are multiple different ways you can get to a final answer with these. So be sure to take on this question, take a look at the rubric. As long as you're able to explain it in sort of one of the ways that makes sense to you, then you should be good in this question.